Vale, muy bien, pues vamos a continuar para no perder más tiempo. Bueno, os presento ahora a Marina Vishmidt. Ella es escritora y crítica y también vive en Londres. Y bueno, su escritura está dedicada principalmente a cuestiones en torno al arte, al trabajo, la materialidad, también el feminismo y la forma-valor. Su interés se centra en la relación entre la práctica y sus condiciones, la práctica artística, y en las formas de subjetividad que producen esa práctica y esas condiciones, ¿no? Acaba de terminar su tesis doctoral en la Universidad Queen Mary y esta tesis doctoral está dedicada a la especulación como un modo de producción de arte y capital. Entre sus publicaciones destacar Uncorporate Identity, editado en 2010 con Metahaven, Media Mutandis, Art, Technologies and Politics, publicado por Node en Londres en 2006. Y también comentar que contribuye en catálogos y revistas internacionales de arte como Mute, Articultura como Mute Online, también Afterall, Parkett, Texte, Kunst, entre otras. Y bueno, también que ha colaborado en diferentes proyectos colectivos como Unemployed Cinema y también la distribuidora de cine feminista Cinenova. Y sin más, os dejo con la presentación de Marina.
Okay. Hello. Okay, so I guess, as maybe was you mentioned before, I guess this is a kind of development of notes. Maybe those of you who've been in the reading group have already had some, have already seen or read. And this was also kind of developed with relation to the other presentations that you've either already heard or will hear today. And we'll discuss today and tomorrow. So this is really kind of, in a way, I think Anthony's presentation is a really good background in kind of developing the negativity already sort of materially present in different historical phases and structural parameters of the class relation, and in a way I want to keep that in mind in what I'm going to be presenting, because I think that's quite a concrete way of thinking about it. So yeah, this focuses on abolition, or rather self-abolition. So what I'm trying to clarify in this presentation, and hopefully actually clarify in the discussion, is how what Ray Brassier formulates as the paradox of self-abolition in his essay, Wandering Abstraction. But I'm also going to talk about self-abolition more generally, and more particularly in other kind of movements and schools of thought. Can help us understand the processes of dissolution and constitution implied by a revolutionary transformation of social relations, and what role the concept of a subject can play within that. Basically, the supposed paradoxicality of self-abolition, when considered to its logical conclusion, does no more than illuminate the shortcomings of the concept of abolition itself as a prescription for any, so to speak, real movement or current struggles. And that's to the extent that abolition evokes precisely a logical rather than materially rooted notion of overcoming, which is something that gets played out in Ray's text, one which does not come to grips with transformative negativity as an encounter with the actuality of historical as well as structural contingency, as it registers in the present and in the past. So, for the moment, I would like to articulate the different notions of self-abolition which are at play in Brassier's text, but also via the positions that he imputes to endnotes, also in Fred Moten, in Monique Wittig, and finally in a text by Maya Gonzalez, which sets out a perspective on the abolition of women, which doesn't exactly map onto gender abolition, because that gets sort of used in other kinds of discourses as well. Or it can be insofar as gender is mapped onto class, so the abolition of women as the abolition of the gender relation, and both of its terms. In all these positions, the paradox of self-abolition applies to a collective subject, or a subject that becomes collective in the process of its abolition, self-abolition, that is, in struggle. For Ray Brassier, self-abolition can only escape its paradoxical status by means of rationality, choosing between good and bad mediations with the world as a process of emancipation from the real abstractions of capital, guided by a self-legislating or self-determined rule, autonomy, in the Kantian Marxian reading of species being. For Fred Moten, aesthetic experience can produce unknown worlds from the place of a nothingness, or rather a racialized nothingness, which a history of commodification and oppression has generated. And this is the substance of what he refers to as the Black radical tradition, social invention and resistance arising from the site of social death. Here, self-abolition is figured as emancipatory but not rational, and that happens to a racialized subject which has never been a subject, or always been abolished by capital and colonial domination. For Monique Wittig, the 1970s French Marxist feminist, self-abolition is decisively class-based, and that's the class of women, and the heteropatriarchal gender relation that creates women as subject and subjected. It can only happen through the process of struggle, which passes through a transitional point through the individual, a type of subject that women as a class have to pass through, which is to say, strategically affirm as a category of struggle because they have been deprived of subjectivity by the domination of gender, of the gender relation. For Maya Gonzalez, gender is akin to value. It is a social form separating people not so much from their humanity as from their mutability as social beings, their changeability. This is a position which, in a way, is kind of shared by everyone that I'm talking about, who talks about self-abolition in this text. Class identity on the basis of being a woman, which you can say maybe feminism is in a way kind of theorizing that kind of identity, is just as impossible and bound to fail as class identity on the basis of being a worker. We can certainly deploy these identities in struggle, but we will run up against their limits, and they do not describe the social relations that the process of communization would wish to achieve. So real abstractions such as gender, or rather the duality of men and women, value and labor, are the blocks placed upon this human capacity of openness, reshaping itself under historical conditions which are only partially of its own choosing. So Marx's concept of species being, although it's an equivocal concept and liable to essentializing and humanist affirmations, does seem at least relevant here, insofar as it gestures to a kind of conscious or historical ability to transform its relationship to its environment and its own constitution. Ray Brassier invokes species being, saying, quote, "It is precisely generic identification with what Marx called species being, understood not as a biological category, but as the capacity for collective self-transformation beyond self-reproduction, that staves off the divisive identifications of individuality, ethnicity, nationality, etc." So, more detail about how Brassier talks about the paradox of self-abolition. So what he sets out to do in the text, Wandering Abstraction, which I guess you've all read, is he tries to articulate the constitutive, what he sees as the constitutive blind spots, both of communization theory, developed primarily through his engagement with endnotes, alongside the blind spots of accelerationism, by looking at the relationship between cognitive and social abstraction as a basis for revolutionary thought and practice. What I would like to focus on here is what he calls the paradox of self-abolition, as he sees it operating in the text of Endnotes. The paradox of self-abolition is that the agent who instigates the abolition must end up abolishing itself, thus necessarily reinstating itself. So he's following the Hegelian negation of the negation trajectory, which seems to end up with an affirmation of that which is to be destroyed, since it's seen as a logical process without residue, without a remainder. Perhaps if he was thinking more of the kind of Adornian approach of negative dialectics, it wouldn't be quite so smooth. So he writes, quote, "For Endnotes, we are constituted through and through by the capital relation, and it is the rupture with the reproduction of ourselves as so constituted at the scale of the totality that will form the horizon of revolutionary or all struggles." And then with quote within a quote, he quotes Endnotes. "In any actual supersession of the capitalist class relation, we ourselves must be overcome. We, quote unquote, we have no, quote unquote, position apart from the capitalist class relation. What we are is, at the deepest level, constituted by this relation, and it is a rupture with the reproduction of what we are that will necessarily form the horizon of our struggles." So, end of quote. He goes on, "This then has specific political and strategic consequences." Again, quote from Endnotes. "In this period, the we of revolution does not affirm itself, does not identify itself positively, because it cannot. It cannot assert itself against the they of capital without being confronted by the problem of its own existence. An existence which it will be the nature of the revolution to overcome. There's nothing to affirm in the capitalist class relation. No autonomy, no alternative, no outside, no secession." End quote. So then he carries on, Ray carries on. "The problem here is who is then the subject or agent of communization, that is, the destruction of the social relations that reproduce us, as well as how we, as fully constituted by the capital relation, can break with it." So, end quote. So here, I guess, a lot depends on the work which the phrase fully constituted is being called on to do. And the way this constitution plays out makes the difference between kind of logicist or logic fetishizing argument and the materialist one. Because communization is figured, following Ray's account, because communization is figured as a process without a subject, there turns out to be some reliance on quasi-objective factors, such as immiseration caused by being surplus to the reproduction of capital, or the limits met in traditional workers, or identity struggles. This then leaves the communization thesis open to accusations of a mechanical reading of revolutionary activity, which, according to Brassier, Endnotes have recently tried to address through a philosophical framing of agency as the spontaneity inherent in freedom. In Brassier's reading, quote, "It seems plausible to suggest that Endnotes need recourse to freedom in this transcendental sense, in order to stave off the paradox of self-abolition, by grounding the possibility of human agency in a source that is independent of the class relation. As the ultimate wellspring of human activity, this transcendental, as opposed to empirical, spontaneity may be construed as what constitutes the class relation, independently of the class relation's constitution of the we." End quote. He goes on, "Value subsumption of labor as posited presupposition," sorry, there's a lot of long quotes in this bit. There's a lot of long quotes throughout. So. Also presupposes something that it does not posit, spontaneous human activity. As Endnotes themselves make clear, the spontaneity invoked here should be understood in the Kantian sense, as the determination of sensation exercised by the human mind in the act of thinking. Kant attributed the spontaneity to what he called pure apperception. Then he quotes Endnotes. "In the 18th century, when Kant described the transcendental unity of apperception, the fact that I am aware of myself as having my own experiences, he called this a spontaneous act. Kant meant the opposite of something natural. A spontaneous act is one that is freely undertaken. In fact, the word spontaneous derives from the Latin sponte, meaning of one's own accord, freely, willingly. In this sense, spontaneity is not about acting compulsively or automatically. It is a matter of acting without external constraint. It's the end of the endnotes quote. And Ray comments, the paradox is then diffused because the agent of the abolition is distinct from the abolished agent. But in opposing spontaneity to compulsion, endnotes risk resuscitating a transcendental voluntarism in which the human will functions as a mysterious, not to say supernatural, unmoved mover, impervious to external determination. End of quote. So Brassier, while supporting the rigor of endnotes' formulations, wants to see how self-cancellation can be thought otherwise than positing a collective or humanist subject of revolt. He thus tries to put forward a conception of spontaneity that he believes is richer, one where the structure of spontaneity is the reflexive embrace of mediation with the world, or the appropriation and transformation of rules, as the characteristically human practice of reflexive self-negation, the agency that changes its context and changes itself in the process, which is also, again, going back to Marx's concept of species being as a materialist, open and historical notion of what is constituted by the human, as against biological or idealistic conceptions. So, quote from Brassier, transcendental spontaneity is rational self-determination, as the internalization of conceptual constraint. In this sense, spontaneity is thinking, and it is thinking as a kind of doing, rather than as contemplation, which is the source of the human activities and practices that constitute the abstractions of capital. But the spontaneity whose exercise is the prerequisite for the destruction of the class relation will also generate new abstractions together with new forms of mediation. What is required is an understanding of social practices that would allow us to begin distinguishing between oppressive and emancipatory forms of mediation. End quote. What could be pushed further here, as will be pointed out by endnotes and Sick at this event, is that the idea of embracing abstractions and new forms of mediation can function in Ray's text or in the theory more generally, in kind of the debate of communization theory with proponents of kind of so-called transition. We could call it the transition debate. Also maybe summed up by Alberto Toscano in the text on Prometheanism. Can function as an appeal to a sort of common sense, which remains underspecified and programmatically so. At the same time, the appeal to rationality as a way to overcome the voluntarism and humanism of spontaneity brings its own set of assumptions that place themselves beyond the bounds of reflection in Brassier's own conceptualization, while serving as the basis of invalidation of the opponent, here figured as the overly abstract vision of spontaneity allegedly evoked by endnotes to overcome their so-called overdetermination problem. However, on this level, we can say that any political prescription will repeat the underspecification of its terms, insofar as it's a prescription, with the risk that the dispute founders in the very accommodating nature these terms acquire as a result. But maybe it's not possible to avoid formalism at the level of prescription. The interesting matter is rather what can be articulated with or through it. And following on from that, I'd like to go into a discussion of a couple of different formulations of self-abolition. These are based in strands of revolutionary theory that reckon with the racialized and gendered implications of the subject and apply different understandings of self-abolition to this historically differentiated subject. So one is from Fred Moten, drawing on the discussions of subjectivity as subjection in, for example, Foucault and Butler, to be countered with ideas of speaking as and through the position of being an object, drawn from the legal personhood and material histories of African slavery, or rather the demolition of legal personhood in African slavery, and on theories of nothingness as an emancipatory condition, drawing on Afro-pessimist writing. And the other notion of self-abolition comes from Monique Wittig, who talks about subjecthood as a transitional category which allows us to abolish gender as a class relationship. And this is followed by a discussion of gender abolition in endnotes, primarily through Maya Gonzalez, who's a member of the collective, from several years ago, which is inflected by the communization theory that we talked about at the beginning. Like Wittig, Gonzalez focuses on the destruction of the category women rather than the abstraction of gender per se, with the assumption that the negative pole of women in the gender relation is analogous to that of the proletariat in the class relation. The relation itself is abolished with the self-moving abolition of its negative or its subjugated pole. Unlike Wittig, Gonzalez seeks a, so to speak, structural explanation for why gender should be abolished. And it is like the one communization has for the class relation. Capital no longer needs women as women, just like capital no longer needs workers to identify as workers per se. In other words, capital may still need people to occupy the position and perform the tasks associated with women, just like it needs to extract value from labor, but a political identity based on either of these positions is now untenable, as the strategic affirmation of either of these social roles can have no emancipatory or transformative implications in the present, when it is no longer a question of being included in the social contract, but of overturning it. Or it may be clearer if we think about it as overturning it as part of a large-scale movement of social transformation, because obviously capital and the state are also overturning it from their own perspective. Thus, it is both an objective and a subjective moment, but in every case, though the needs of class-based and gender-based struggles are shown as incompatible with one another in Maya's text, because of the trans-historical denegation of women in social reproduction and the history of the workers' movement with regard to the women question, self-abolition is still seen as the structure adequate to model the overcoming of both social forms. What's important to underline here is that the paradox of self-abolition is not a logical problem, as I believe Brassier's argument through and from endnotes demonstrates, although his allusion to Kantian spontaneity via endnotes has other problems, some of which I've outlined briefly, as well as sort of productive aspects. The reason it's not merely a logical problem is that it attests to the fact that the horizon of transformation is form determined by the real abstractions to be transformed or done away with. So unless the problem of subjectivity or the politics of subjectivation, and that's maybe how I would phrase this problem of will, which for Ray, for obvious theoretical reasons, doesn't want to frame in those terms. I mean, obvious theoretical reasons within Ray's philosophical project. Unless the problem of subjectivity is addressed, the paradox remains all too concrete, as we've seen in every historical situation of insurrection, of revolution, even more minimally of self-organization. That is, the problem of subjectivity shaped and deformed by power, a vision of emancipation itself shaped by relations of power, if not in ideology, then in the experience of struggle against a powerful antagonist, no less than in the experience of existing capitalist social relations per se. The contradiction between capital and labor, in other words, is less than ever an external one. It is perhaps precisely because the reproduction of labor is now totally dependent on the reproduction of capital that the question of the subject of self-abolition, the subject of negation, has to be developed within the process of critical reflexivity which theory represents for struggles, as mentioned in Federico's paper yesterday. In other words, the determining agency of real abstractions on such a subject explored in Brassier's engagement with endnotes has to be seen not as some undifferentiated process of real subsumption, but precisely as shaping, but not exhausting, the antagonism posed through this subject, which is strictly immanent to the capital relation. Because of, how this immanence is experienced, whether or not we want to have recourse to rationality or spontaneity to describe it. So, to speak about Fred Moten and his sort of understanding of abolition or self-abolition. Fred Moten, in his essay from a year ago, Blackness and Nothingness, Mysticism in the Flesh, talks about how the conceptual production of Afro-pessimism, and that's one which is also important for a text I'm going to briefly talk about later, the one published recently on Mute about the riots in Ferguson. How Afro-pessimism allows us, quote, to begin to consider what nothing is, not from its own standpoint or from any standpoint, but from the absoluteness of its generative dispersion of a general antagonism that blackness holds and protects in as critical celebration and degenerative and regenerative preservation. What's the relationship between blackness, thingliness, nothingness, and the de- and regenerative operations of what Deleuze might call a life in common? End quote. This is the proposition of subjectivation as a nothing, but arising from a dialectic between the historical conditions of expropriation from subjectivity, the collapse between variable and fixed capital in the experience and institution of slavery, and the socializing or socializable dimension of this nothingness as a commonality, that is, as a general antagonism within the capital relation, a nothingness as the basis of sociality. The implication here, it seems to me, is that the other side of lived real abstraction, the degree zero of not just having but being a commodity, of living as a negation of all that is human and full of meaning, generates an experience of contingency which is predicated both in absolute negation as the baseline condition of existence, of social life, and the contingencies of experiencing this condition as shared, of transient affirmations, or rather inhabitations. Moten writes in his book, In the Break, The Aesthetics of the Black Radical Tradition, that, quote, the history of blackness is testament to the fact that objects can and do resist. Blackness, the extended movement of a specific upheaval, an ongoing eruption that disarranges every line, is a strain that pressures the assumption of the equivalence of personhood and subjectivity. I want to show the interarticulation of the resistance of the object with Marx's subjunctive figure of the commodity who speaks. According to Marx, the speaking commodity is an impossibility invoked only to militate against mystifying notions of the commodity's essential value. My argument starts with the historical reality of commodities who spoke, of laborers who were commodities before, as it were, the abstraction of labor power from their bodies, and who continue to pass on this material heritage across the divide that separates slavery and so-called freedom. But I'm interested, finally, in the implications of the breaking of such speech, the elevating disruptions of the verbal, that take the rich content of the objects or commodities' orality outside the confines of meaning precisely by way of this material trace. End quote. The impossibility of integration is shown at the limit case, the racialized subject which never had subjectivity, yet has survived through and despite the basis of this antagonistic condition, in a far from schematic way, an existence permeated not just by structural nothingness, but by physical annihilation, the violence that this nothingness produces. It both can and cannot be generalized as the impossibility of integration, of being valorized within the existing conditions of reproduction of capital as we live it today. The mediations disappeared within the speaking commodity do not just include labor power as such, but racialized and gendered labor power, and the figure of the slave as the speaking commodity brings this into sharp relief. At the same time, the concept of real subsumption is challenged in lots of complicated ways by the existence of the slave, who cannot be subsumed because she is already part of the machinery as it is constituted, she who is outside the productive relation because she's a precondition for it. Moten's conception also importantly challenges and displaces Brassier's, vastly different as their apparatus of argumentation is. On the point that the constitution of social being as social death, while not outside capitalist social life, and its form determination of those processes that seek to resist or overcome it, partakes of nothingness as a structural constant, rather than the delusive fullness of capitalist mechanisms of social reproduction, and thus starts out from a specific place in the process of self-abolition. The other main challenge is to the understanding of the emancipatory potential of spontaneity. For Brassier, it is related to a collectively self-determined rationality, while for Moten, it is music and language that illuminates the conditions of the general antagonism, aesthetic experience, disrupting, quote, the confines of meaning precisely by way of this material trace. And now a little bit, quite a bit, from Monique Wittig, and apologies for the long quote again. So she writes, we must try to understand philosophically, and in brackets politically, these concepts of subject and class consciousness and how they work in relation to our history. When we discover that women are the objects of oppression and appropriation, at the very moment we become able to perceive this, we become subjects in the sense of cognitive subjects through an operation of abstraction. Consciousness of oppression is not only a reaction to oppression or a fight against oppression. It is also the whole conceptual reevaluation of the social world, its whole reorganization with new concepts from the point of view of oppression. It is what I would call the science of oppression created by the oppressed. This operation of understanding reality has to be undertaken by every one of us. Call it a subjective, cognitive practice. The movement back and forth between the levels of reality, the conceptual reality and the material reality of oppression, and they're both social realities, is accomplished through language. It is we who historically must undertake the task of defining the individual subject in materialist terms. This certainly seems to be an impossibility, since materialism and subjectivity have always been mutually exclusive. Nevertheless, and rather than despair of ever understanding, we must recognize the need to reach subjectivity and the abandonment by many of us to the myth woman, the myth of woman being only a snare that holds us up. This real necessity for everyone to exist as an individual as well as a member of a class is perhaps the first condition for the accomplishment of a revolution, without which there can be no real fight or transformation. But the opposite is also true. Without class and class consciousness, there are no real subjects, only alienated individuals. For women to answer the question of the individual subject in materialist terms is first to show, as the lesbians and feminists did, that supposedly subjective, individual, private problems are in fact social problems, class problems. That sexuality is not for women an individual and subjective expression, but a social institution of violence. But once we've shown that all so-called personal problems are in fact class problems, we will still be left with the question of the subject of each singular woman, not the myth, but each one of us. At this point, let us say that a new personal and subjective definition for all humankind can only be found beyond the categories of sex, women and man, and that the advent of individual subjects demands first destroying the categories of sex, ending the use of them, and rejecting all sciences which still use these categories as their fundamentals, and practically all social sciences. For us, this is an absolute necessity. Our survival demands that we contribute all our strength to the destruction of the class of women, within which men appropriate women. This can be accomplished only by the destruction of heterosexuality as a social system, which is based on the oppression of women by men, and which produces the doctrine of the difference between the sexes to justify this oppression. End of that quote. And that's from The Straight Mind and Other Essays. So in this long quote I've just presented, we get a number of moves. The rationality of Marxist feminism here is seen as self-abolition, very, very plainly and simply. Yet a number of mediations present themselves: class, individual, sexuality, women, subjects, mediations with a very complicated and obviously often unhelpful historical and political baggage. Wittig indicates the dialectics between individual and class in the movement of self-abolition. One must be attained, abolished, then the next, to be abolished, etc. All of them have to be moved through, their potential seized, their limits realized. With relation to Moten, to answer the question of individual subject in materialist terms, Wittig does not want to linger in the hallucinatory, still unknown, mediations of nothingness. She's a good worker and wants to embark on the labor of the negative. Self-abolition is a long process, punctuated by the strategic affirmation of a number of ultimately undesirable identities, which are dialectically discarded. Each is not all, and thus does not complete a movement, either positively or negatively. I said before that the abolition of women as a process of self-abolition implicitly models women on the proletariat, the same structure of a revolutionary subject. In Wittig, this is not metaphoric, but women are immediately a class, a historical class formed in a class relation with men, to serve the dominant social group, men. Part of the self-abolition of women will be the elimination of women as a class in relation to men. Hence her famous position, which I'm not going to discuss here, that lesbians are not women, because they are not subordinated to men, just as you can't have workers without capitalists. And maybe it would have been even more interesting. Instead of talking about her, I could have read an extract of her novel, dystopian, poetic sci-fi novel called Les Guerrières, The Female Guerrillas, about a violent and ritualistic women's society in and after the gender war. So the gender relation here is figured as strongly overdetermined by the dominant term, just like the capital relation. In accordance with this, although much more schematically, at least in this text, we can look at Maya Gonzalez writing in Communisation and the Abolition of Gender, quote, "In the course of struggle, women will therefore come into conflict with men. They will be criticized for derailing the movement, for diverting it from its primary goals. But the goal of the struggle lies elsewhere. It is only from within this and other conflicts that the proletariat will come to see its class belonging as an external constraint, an impasse which it will have to overcome in order to be anything at all beyond its relation to capital. That overcoming is only the revolution as communisation which destroys gender and all the other divisions that come between us." End quote. The important point here is that unless self-abolition is extended to the overcoming of the gender relation, as it functions to reproduce capital and the relations between men and women, the self-abolition of the proletariat, under whatever conditions it happens, will never pose an adequate resolution to the woman question in its own right. While here stated as a series of axioms, Gonzalez's point is crucial with regard to the paradox of self-abolition, as formulated by Ray Brassier. Those who are constituted by a relation cannot at the same time abolish that relation, also because they are constituted as particular subjects, or non-subjects, as we see in Fred Moten, within that process, with very different relations to overcoming that entails. So, as Gonzalez says, the politics and ethics of gender are commonly overlooked by those who want to smash capitalism. Thus, the self-abolition starts from different places, depending on what is to be abolished. As we see for Wittig, certain things must be realized before being abolished, which to my mind is both highly ambiguous, leaving us with an argument nowhere near as clean as Gonzalez's, but also very suggestive. So, final notes on abolition. The virtue of the thinking of abolition is that it sets a horizon decisively within the immanence of struggle. The structural analysis of abolition is interested in determinate negation, that is, not an abstract and ideal dismissal of certain elements or structures of the present, but seeing what is the specific structural role those elements have in the reproduction of the total system we'd want to change or get rid of. But there are still limitations to the concept, no less than to the implied praxis of abolition. Whoa. Abolishing my computer, excuse me. This chiefly has to do with a break between the determinacy of the analysis and the abstraction of the imperative to abolish, as well as the strict analytic split between structure and history. Oh, thank you. Thanks. One of the most salient of these abstractions is the so-called paradox of self-abolition, which is addressed in I would say, in a very specific philosophical context in Ray Brassier's text. The subject of abolition emerges through the struggle that abolition entails, yet must also arrive at a point where the militant identity emerging through struggle has to eliminate its basis in the society the movement wants to change or overcome. This is not a situation which can be dealt with by fiat, but has to be one of the modes and horizons of struggle itself, in which it will continue to unfold as a painful contradiction. Who's the subject that initiates and who comes out of the other side of self-abolition? The politics of abolition seem to be unable either to be done with or even to really formulate this paradox of subjectivity, even as the framing of the paradox itself by Brassier, as will be discussed by endnotes, suffers from the motivated collapse of history and structure, or, and I modify endnotes' phrasing here, the empirical and theoretical registers of the problem, while at the same time diagnosing exactly such an elision in the endnotes position and calling it a paradox. The problematic of abolition also stands within the question of mediation. What is to be abolished, and do the processes of abolition not necessarily partake of what they are setting out to abolish? The abolition discourse seems to harbor within it a slide into Gnosticism, in its postulation of a wholesale cancellation of an irredeemably fallen world. We can, in the most preliminary way here, definitely not going into it, note, with Hegel, that if the real is the rational and the rational is the real, it is because to the degree the real did not take its present form accidentally, but through an ongoing series of complex historical mediations as part of the rationality of capital in its reproduction, for example, or state rationality, neither can it change in any other way. The real can only negate it dialectically, preserving by cancelling, coming to find out what it, the thing, really is in the collective process of overcoming. Why this idea has maybe become more recessed in the political thinking of the present and supplanted by the immediatist premises that can be discovered within abolition is that there is nothing like a historical movement right now whose destiny seems to be self-abolition. Therefore, counterintuitively, it is more than ever the only option. But this is echoed the more hollowly, the more mournfully. The question posed by Brassier in his text, the question then, quote, the question then is given the ontological inversion through which material life itself is now animated by capital, who or what are the agents of communization, end quote, is the question of the hypothesis of real subsumption. As such, it leaves us with a real and a false problem. The false problem first. The assumption of real subsumption is that theoretical objects of experience called capital and life are now coextensive, that, so to speak, everything is incorporated, which becomes a kind of empty premise and a tautology. It eliminates space for analysis, for struggle, for real contradiction, and the painful insolubility of those contradictions in the rooms where we speak, make, and operate. It is, in other words, a comfortable hypothesis, which is why it gets adopted as an easy form of radicalism, first and foremost in cultural scenes. I'm not going to elaborate on that really, but I see it as a form of idealism which forms the kind of radical other face of the discourse of the commons and alternative economies, which is the other strong vein of criticality running through contemporary art and activist milieus. As Ray writes about real abstractions in his text, quote, "This logicization of social reality explains why there can be a contradiction between what human beings think and do in relating to themselves or what they think and do in reproducing capital." So he's talking about real abstractions, I guess. But this logicization of the value form is not absolute. It applies to human activities and practices only insofar as they constitute labor. These activities and practices persist within the capital relation as phenomena that it has incorporated but not wholly absorbed. They are not wholly absorbed because they constitute the process through which capital absorbs labor. Capital's self-reproduction is constituted by phenomena that it cannot reproduce, even as it reproduces the labor which in turn reproduces it. Thus, capital's logicization of reality is itself conditioned by that reality. This is the bulwark against absolute idealism, and I would say the real subsumption partakes of a kind of absolute idealism insofar as it sees itself as a totalization, rather than a specific conflictual description of a process, a labor process. And I think that's also, Anthony described it as existentialist, perhaps, for that reason. Which would hypothesize capital as a wholly autonomous, self-moving subject, a self-causing being, floating free of material reality altogether. Unquote. So that's the false problem. But the real problem, and I will conclude here, which is diagnosed by the partial and problematic term of paradox in Ray's text, is that some communization theory attempts to separate subjectivity and theory from struggles, while positing theory as the self-critical or reflexive moment of struggles. The first move is more questionable than the first. The first move is more questionable than the second. The terms in which self-criticism is posed are both the ethical and political milieu of any movement or struggle, and that which emerges in the process of struggle themselves. Struggle is never its own answer, it's only ever a question. The question is, why are struggles so rare? There's no externality possible here, and yet the self-criticism of, actually existing movements does echo terms such as democracy, horizontality, or the conspiratorial figure of neoliberalism, which according to communization theory are not adequate to the struggles we face today. Then something must be wrong. The limits have yet to be encountered. Historical experience will show what strategies are possible and impossible, what is living and dead. But it hasn't, and it won't. It can't. We need to look at subjectivity as part of the moment, how it has been shaped by the violence of accumulation and state management in this current moment and historically. We need to deal with politics and actual historical limits of struggles and imagination, the actual material bases of decomposition and negativity to the present, which are driven by capital and the state at the moment, rather than deal with axiomatics which have a great deal of explanatory power but ultimately rely on generalities. So, the inability of people to reproduce themselves within existing social relations of capital can have a mobilizing effect, obviously, and we've seen this. What it cannot do is prescribe the political direction such mobilizations can take, given the greater accessibility or the greater familiarity and lived experience of reactionary viewpoints on the left and the right. So here I find the thinking of contingency more helpful than abolition, since the contingency of survival on capital's terms is brought home even more starkly in encounters with the state, brutally trying to efface the fact of its own contingency through arms and the law. Contingency also extends to the agenda of a movement. A defensive struggle may develop propositional characteristics that it didn't have before, including strategies that recognize the scale of change necessary even to defend the existing terms, as well as to redefine the terrain. And part of redefining the terrain could be putting into question the division between production and reproduction, for example, in ways other than the ones enforced by the recomposition of capital right now. Yeah, thank you. Sorry, that's it.
We could have a short break.
Maybe a short break.
A short break, yes. Menos cuarto. We have a short break.
Very short.
Yes, like 5 minutes. Vamos a tener 5 minutitos. Okay.
Huh?
Reading.
Reading.